Chapter 5. The next day, the students drifted in slowly as usual. Some took their seats, others stood around talking. Robert Billings was by the window, tying knots in the blind cords. While he was doing that, Brad, his incessant tormentor, walked past and patted him on the back, sticking a small sign that said "Kick me" to his shirt. It looked like just another typical day in history class until the kids noticed that their teacher had written in large letters across the blackboard, "Strength through discipline." "What's that supposed to mean?" someone asked. "I'll tell you just as soon as you're all seated," Ben Ross answered. When the kids were all in their places, he began to lecture. "Today I am going to talk to you about discipline." A collective groan went up from the seated students. There were some teachers whose classes you knew would be a drag, but most of the students expected Ross's history class to be pretty good, which meant no dumb lectures on stuff like discipline. "Hold it," Ben told them. "Before you make a judgment, give this a chance. It could be exciting." "Oh, sure," someone said. "Oh, sure is right," Ben told his students. "Now, when I talk about discipline, I'm talking about power," he said, making a fist to accentuate the point. "And I'm talking about success. Success through discipline. Is there anyone here who isn't interested in power and success?" "Probably Robert," Brad said. A bunch of kids snickered. "Now wait," Ben told them. "David, Brian, Eric, you play football. You already know it takes discipline to win." "That must be why we haven't won a game in 2 years," Eric said, and the class laughed. It took their teacher a few moments to calm them down again. "Listen," he said, gesturing toward a pretty red-haired student who appeared to be sitting taller in her chair than those around her. "Andrea, you're a ballet dancer. Doesn't it take ballet dancers long, hard hours of work to develop their skills?" She nodded, and Ross turned to the rest of the class. "It's the same with every art. Painting, writing, music, all of them take years of hard work and discipline to master. Hard work, discipline, and control." "So what?" said a student who was slouching down in his chair. "So what?" Ben asked. "I'll show you. Suppose I could prove to you that you can create power through discipline. Suppose we could do it right here in this classroom. What would you say to that?" Ross had expected another wisecrack, and he was surprised when it didn't come. Instead, the students were becoming interested and curious. Ben went behind his desk and pulled his wooden chair in front of the room so that all the students could see it. "All right," he said, "discipline begins with posture. Amy, come up here for a minute." As Amy rose, Brian mumbled, "Teacher's pet." Normally, that would have been enough to start the entire class laughing, but only a few chuckled. The rest ignored him. Everyone was wondering what their teacher was up to. As Amy sat in the chair at the front of the room, Ben instructed her on how to sit. "Place your hands flat across the small of your back and force your spine straight up. There. Can't you breathe more easily?" Around the classroom, many of the students were imitating the position they saw Amy taking. But even though they were sitting straighter, some couldn't help finding it humorous. David was the next to try his hand at a joke. "Is this history, or did I just come to phys ed by mistake?" he asked. A few kids laughed, but still tried to improve their posture. "Come on, David," Ben said. "Give it a try. We've had enough wise guy remarks." Grudgingly, David pushed himself up straight in his chair. Meanwhile, the teacher walked down each aisle, checking the posture of each student. It was amazing, Ross thought. Somehow he hooked them. Why, even Robert. "Class," Ben announced, "I want everyone to see how Robert's legs are parallel. His ankles are locked, his knees are bent at 90 degrees. See how straight his spine is? Chin tucked in, head up. That's very good, Robert." Robert, the class nerd, looked up at his teacher and smiled briefly, then returned to his stiff, upright position. Around the room, the other students tried to copy him. Ben returned to the front of the classroom. "All right. Now I want you all to get up and walk around the room. When I give the command, I want you to return to your seats as quickly as possible and assume the proper seating posture. Come on, everyone, up, up, up." The students stood up and started wandering around the room. Ben knew he couldn't let them go too long or they'd lose their concentration on the exercise, so he quickly said, "Take your seats." The students dashed back to their seats. There were bumps and grunts as a few ran into each other, and around the room some kids laughed. But the dominant sound was the loud scraping of the chair legs as the kids sat down. In the front of the room, Ben shook his head. That was the most disorganized mess I've ever seen. This isn't Duck Duck Goose. This is an experiment in movement and posture. Now come on, let's try again. This time without the chatter. The quicker and more controlled you are, the faster you will be able to reach your seats properly. Okay, now everyone up. For the next 20 minutes, the class practiced getting out of their seats, wandering around in apparent disorganization, and then, at their teacher's command, quickly returning to their seats in the correct seated posture. Ben shouted orders more like a drill sergeant than a teacher. Once they seemed to have mastered quick and correct seating, he threw in a new twist. They would still leave their seats and return, but now they would return from the hallway, and Ross would time them with a stopwatch. On the first try, it took 48 seconds. The second time, they were able to do it in half a minute. Before the last attempt, David had an idea. Listen, he told his classmates as they stood outside in the hall waiting for Mr. Ross's signal. Let's line up in the order of who has to go the furthest to reach their desk inside. That way, we won't have to bump into each other. The rest of the class agreed. As they got into the correct order, they couldn't help noticing that Robert was at the head of the line. The new head of the class, someone whispered as they waited nervously for the teacher to give them the sign. Ben snapped his fingers, and the column of students moved quickly and quietly into the room. As the last student reached his seat, Ben clicked the stopwatch off. He was smiling. 16 seconds. The class cheered. All right, quiet down, their teacher said, returning to the front of the room. To his surprise, the students calmed down quickly. The silence that suddenly filled the room was almost eerie. Normally, the only time the room was that still, Ross thought, was when it was empty. Now, there are 3 more rules that you must obey, he told them. 1. Everybody must have pencils and notepaper for note-taking. 2. When asking or answering a question, you must stand at the side of your seats. And 3. The first words you say when answering or asking a question are, Mr. Ross. All right? Around the room, heads nodded. All right, Mr. Ross said. Brad, who is the British Prime Minister before Churchill? Still sitting at his seat, Brad chewed nervously on a fingernail. Wasn't it? But before he could say more, Mr. Ross quickly cut him off. Wrong, Brad. You already forgot the rules I just told you. He looked across the room at Robert. Robert, show Brad the proper procedure for answering a question. Instantly, Robert stood up next to his desk at attention. Mr. Ross. Correct, Mr. Ross said. Thank you, Robert. Oh, this is dumb, Brad mumbled. Just because you couldn't do it right, someone said. Brad, Mr. Ross said. Who was the Prime Minister before Churchill? This time Brad rose and stood beside his desk. Mr. Ross, it was Prime Minister, You're still too slow, Brad, Mr. Ross said. From now on, everyone make your answers as short as possible and spit them out when asked. Now, Brad, try again. This time Brad snapped up beside his seat. Mr. Ross, Chamberlain. Ben nodded approvingly. Now that's the way to answer a question. Punctual, precise, with a punch. Andrea, what country did Hitler invade in September of 1939? Andrea, the ballet dancer, stood stiffly by her desk. Mr. Ross, I don't know. Mr. Ross smiled. Still, a good response because you used proper form. Amy, do you know the answer? Amy hopped up beside her desk. Mr. Ross, Poland. Excellent, Mr. Ross said. Brian, what was the name of Hitler's political party? Brian quickly got out of his chair. Mr. Ross, the Nazis. Mr. Ross nodded. That's good, Brian. Very quick. Now does anyone know the official name of the party? Laurie Sanders stood up beside her desk. The National Socialists. No! There was a sharp bang as Mr. Ross struck his desktop with a ruler. Now do it again correctly. Laurie sat down, a confused look on her face. What had she done wrong? David leaned over and whispered in her ear. Oh, right. She stood up again. Mr. Ross, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Correct, Mr. Ross replied. Mr. Ross kept asking questions, and around the room, students jumped to attention, eager to show that they knew both the answer and the correct form with which to give it. It was a far cry from the normally casual atmosphere of the classroom, but neither Ben nor his students reflected on that fact. They were too caught up in this new game. The speed and precision of each question and answer were exhilarating. Soon, Ben was perspiring as he shouted each question out, and another student rose sharply beside his or her desk to shout back a tense reply. Peter, who proposed the Land Lease Act? Mr. Ross, Roosevelt. Right. Eric, who died in the death camps? Mr. Ross, the Jews. Anyone else, Brad? Mr. Ross, gypsies, homosexuals, and the feeble-minded. Good. Amy, why were they murdered? Mr. Ross, because they weren't part of the superior race. Correct. David, who ran the death camps? Mr. Ross, the SS. Excellent. Out in the hall the bells were ringing, but no one in the classroom moved from their seat. Still carried by the momentum of the class's progress that period, Ben stood at the front of the room and issued the final order of the day. Tonight, finish reading chapter 7 and read the first half of chapter 8. That's all. Class dismissed. Before him, the class rose in what seemed like a single movement and rushed out into the hall. Wow, that was weird. Man, it was like a rush, Brian gasped in the uncharacteristic enthusiasm. He and some of the students from Mr. Ross's class were standing in a tight pack in the corridor, still riding on the energy they felt in the classroom. I've never felt anything like that before, said Eric beside him. Well, it sure beats taking notes, Amy cracked. Yeah, Brian said. He and a couple of other students laughed. Hey, but don't knock it, David said. That was really different. It was like when we all acted together, we were more than just a class. We were a unit. Remember what Mr. Ross said about power? I think he was right. Didn't you feel it? Oh, you're taking it too seriously, said Brad behind him. Yeah, David said. Well, then how do you explain it? Brad shrugged. What's to explain? Ross asked questions, we answered them. It was like any other class, except we had to sit up straight and stand next to our desk. I think you're making a big deal out of nothing. I don't know, Brad, David said, as he turned and left the pack of students. Where are you going? Brian asked. The John, David answered. Catch up to you in the cafeteria. Okay, Brian said. Hey, remember to sit up straight, Brad said, and the others laughed. David pushed through the door to the men's room. He really wasn't sure if Brad was right or not. Maybe he was making a big deal out of nothing, but on the other hand, there had been the feeling that group unity. Maybe it didn't make that much difference in the classroom. After all, you were just answering questions. But suppose you took that group feeling, that high energy feeling, and got the football team into it. There were some good athletes on the team. It made David mad that they had such a bad record. They really weren't that bad. They were just undermotivated and disorganized. David knew that if he could ever get the team even half as charged up as Mr. Ross's history class had been that day, they could tear apart most of the teams in their league. Inside the John, David heard the second bell ring, warning students that the next period was about to begin. He stepped out of the stall and was heading to the sinks when he saw someone and stopped abruptly. The bathroom had emptied out and only one person was left, Robert. He was standing in front of a mirror, tucking in his shirt, unaware that he wasn't alone. As David watched the class loser straighten some of the hair on his head and stared at his reflection, then he snapped to attention and his lips moved silently, as if he was still in Mr. Ross's class, answering questions. David stood motionless as Robert practiced the move again and again. Late that night in their bedroom, Christy Ross sat on the side of the bed in her red nightgown and brushed her long auburn hair. Near her, Ben was pulling his pajamas out of a drawer. You know, he said, I would have thought they'd all hate it, being ordered around and forced to sit straight and recite answers. Instead, they took it like they'd been waiting for something like this their whole lives. It was weird. Don't you think they were just playing it like a game? Chrissy asked, simply competing with each other to see who could be the fastest and straightest? I'm sure that was a part of it, Ben told his wife, but even a game is something you either choose to play or not to play. They didn't have to play that game, but they wanted to. The strangest thing was, once we started, I could feel them wanting more. They wanted to be disciplined, and each time they mastered one discipline, they wanted another. When the bell rang at the end of the period and they were still in their seats, I knew it meant more to them than just a game. Christy stopped brushing her hair. You mean they stayed after the bell? she asked. Ben nodded. That's what I mean. His wife looked at him skeptically, but then grinned. Ben, I think you've created a monster. Hardly, Ben replied, chuckling. Christy put down her brush and rubbed some cream into her face. On his side of the bed, Ben was pulling on his pajama top. Christy was waiting for her husband to lean over for their customary goodnight kiss, but tonight it was not forthcoming. He was still lost in thought. Ben, Christy said. Yeah? Do you think you'll go on with it tomorrow? I don't think so, her husband replied. We got to get on to the Japanese campaign. Christy closed the jar of cream and settled comfortably into the bed, but on his side, Ben still had not moved. He had told his wife how surprisingly enthusiastic his students had been that afternoon, but he had not told her that he, too, had gotten caught up in it. It would almost be embarrassing to admit that he could get swept up in such a simple game, but yet on reflection he knew that he had. The fierce exchange of questions and answers, the quest for perfect discipline, it had been infectious and, in a way, mesmerizing. He had enjoyed his students' accomplishment. Interesting, he thought as he got into bed. Chapter 6. For Ben, what happened the next day was extremely unusual. Instead of his students struggling into class after the bell had rung, it was he who was late. He'd accidentally left his lecture notes and book on Japan in his car that morning and had to run out to the parking lot before class to get them. As he rushed into the classroom, he expected to find a madhouse, but he was in for a surprise. In his room were 5 neat rows of desks, 7 desks to a row. At each desk, a student sat stiffly in the posture Ben had taught them the previous day. The room was silent, and Ross surveyed his class uneasily. Was it a joke? Here and there he saw a face on the verge of smiling, but those were clearly outnumbered by faces at stiff attention, staring straight ahead, concentrating. A few students glanced at him uncertainly, waiting to see if he'd carry it further. Should he? It was such an experience and so different from the norm that it tantalized him. What could they learn from this? What could he learn? Tempted by the unknown, Ben decided it was worth finding out. Well, okay, he said, putting away his notes. What's going on here? The students looked at him uncertainly. Ben looked toward the far side of the room. Robert Billings quickly rose beside his desk. His shirt was tucked in and his hair was combed. Mr. Ross, discipline. Yes, discipline, Mr. Ross agreed, but that's just a part of it. There's something more. And then he turned to the blackboard, and underneath the large strength through discipline from the day before, he added community. He turned back to the class. Community is the bond between people who work and struggle together for a common goal. It's like building a barn with your neighbors. A few students in the room chuckled, but David knew what Mr. Ross was saying. It was what he thought about yesterday after class. It was the kind of team spirit the football team needed. It's the feeling that you're part of something that's more important than yourself, Mr. Ross was telling them. You're a movement, a team, a cause. You're committed to something. I think we ought to be committed, all right, someone mumbled, but the nearby students hushed him. Like discipline, Mr. Ross continued. To understand community fully, you have to experience and participate in it. From now on, our 2 mottos will be strength through discipline and strength through community. Everyone repeat our mottos. Around the room, students rose beside their desk and recited the slogans: strength through discipline, strength through community. A few students, including Lori and Brad, did not join them, but sat uncomfortably in their chairs as Mr. Ross had the class repeat the mottos again. Finally, Lori rose and then Brad, now the entire class beside their desk. What we need now is a symbol for our new community, Mr. Ross told them. He turned back to the board and, after a moment's thought, drew a circle with the outline of a wave inside it. This will be our symbol. A wave is a pattern of change. It has a movement, direction, and impact. From now on, our community, our movement, will be known as the wave. He paused and looked at the class standing at stiff attention, accepting everything he told them. And this will be our salute, he said, cupping his right hand in the shape of a wave and then tapping it against his left shoulder, holding it upright. Class, give the salute, he ordered. The class gave the salute. Some hit their right shoulders instead of their left. Others forgot to hit their shoulders entirely. Again, Ross ordered, making the salute himself. He repeated the exercise until everyone had it right. All right, their teacher said when they'd gotten it. Once again, the class could feel the resurgence of power and unity that had overwhelmed them the day before. This is our salute and our salute only, he told them. Whenever you see another wave member, you will salute. Robert, salute and give our mottos. Standing stiffly beside his seat, Robert performed the salute and replied, Mr. Ross, strength through discipline, strength through community. Very good, Ben said. Peter, Amy, and Eric, salute and recite our motto with Robert. The four students obediently saluted and chanted, Strength through discipline, strength through community. Brian, Andrea, and Lori, Mr. Ross commanded, join them and repeat. Now 7 students joined in the chant, and then 14, then 20, until the whole class was saluting and chanting loudly in unison. Strength through discipline, strength through community. Like a regiment, Ben thought, just like a regiment. In the gym after school, David and Eric sat on the floor in their football practice jerseys. They were a little early for practice and were having a heated debate. I think it's dumb, Eric said as he tied the laces on his cleats. It's just a game in history class, that's all. But that doesn't mean it couldn't work, David insisted. What do you think we learned it for, anyway? To keep it a secret? I'm telling you, Eric, this is just what the team needs. Well, you're going to have to convince Coach Schiller of that, Eric said, and I'm not going to tell him. What are you scared of? David asked. You think Mr. Ross is going to punish me because I tell a couple of people about the wave? Eric shrugged. No, man, I think they're going to laugh. Ryan came out of the locker room and joined them on the floor. Hey, David said, what do you think of us trying to get the rest of the team into the wave? Ben tugged at his shoulder pads and thought about it. You think the wave could stop that 220-pound linebacker from Clarkstown? He asked. I swear, that's all I think about. I keep picturing him calling for the snap, and then the thing appears in front of me, this giant thing in a Clarkstown uniform. It steps on my center, it squashes my guards, it's so big I can't go left, I can't go right, I can't throw over it. Brian rolled on his back on the floor and pretended someone was bearing down on him. It just keeps coming and coming. Ah! Eric and David laughed, and Brian sat up. I'll do anything, he told them. Eat my Wheaties, join the wave, do my homework, anything to stop that guy. More players had gathered around them, including a junior named Dutch, who was the second-string quarterback behind Brian. Everyone on the team knew that Dutch wanted nothing more in the world than to steal Brian's position from him. As a result, the two of them didn't get along. I hear you say that you're afraid of the Clarkstown team, Dutch asked Brian. I'll take your place, man. Just say the word. They let you into the game and we'll have no chance at all, Brian told him. Josh sneered. The only reason you're first string is 'cause you're a senior, he said. Still sitting on the gym floor, Brian gazed up at the junior. Man, you are the most conceited bag of no talent I've ever seen, he said. Oh yeah? Look who's talking, Josh snarled back. The next thing David knew, Brian had jumped to his feet and had fist up. David lunged between the two quarterbacks. That's just what I was talking about, he yelled as he pushed them apart. We're supposed to be a team. We're supposed to support each other. The reason we've been so bad is because all we've been doing is fighting with each other. More football players were in the gym now. What's he talking about? One of them asked. David turned. I'm talking about unity. I'm talking about discipline. We have to start acting like a team, like we have a common goal. Your job on the team isn't to steal another guy's position. Your job is to help this team win. I could help this team win, Dutch said. All Coach Schiller's got to do is make me first string quarterback. No, man, David yelled at him. A bunch of self-serving individuals does not make a team. You know what we've done so bad? You know why we done so bad this year? Because we're 25 one-man teams all wearing the same Gordon High uniforms. You want to be first string quarterback on a team that doesn't win, or do you want to be the second string on a team that does win? Doug shrugged. I'm tired of losing, said another player. Yeah, said someone else. It's a drag. The school doesn't even take us seriously anymore. I'd give up my position and be a water boy if it meant winning a game, said a third. Well, we could win, said David. I'm not saying we'll be able to go out and destroy Clarkstown on Saturday, but if we start trying to be a team, I bet we could win a few games this year. Most of the members of the football team were there by this time, and as David looked around at their faces, he could see that they were interested. Okay, said one. What do we do? David hesitated for a moment. What could they do? What they could do was to wave, but who was he to tell them? He'd only learned of it the day before himself. Suddenly, he felt someone nudging him. Tell them, Eric whispered. Tell them about the wave. What the hell? David thought. Okay, all I know is you gotta start by learning the mottos, and this is a salute. Okay,